Good evening and welcome back. Grab yourself a nice cup of tea and relax because we are travelling back in time to 1859 where Paul Morphy is commentating on the 1834 game between Bourdonnais and McDonnell. And if you're wondering what's going on with these pictures here, well, there are no known images that exist of Alexander McDonnell, so I have Father Dougal standing in for him because he is of course another famous Irishman. And I've only been able to find drawings of Bourdonnais, so I have Zero Mostel standing in for Bourdonnais here. So what happened in the previous game, the first game of the series, was that McDonnell with the black pieces had all the chances but managed to throw them all away and draw the game. So this game, they retain the same coloured pieces, so it seems that draws are not counted, and they're so not counted that if you draw, you retain the same pieces. So Bourdonnais had the white pieces last time, and so he starts with the white pieces this time. So let's proceed with the match. He opens with e4. We have e5 from McDonnell, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, McDonnell captures straight away, and bishop to c4. And McDonnell plays queen to f6. So Morphy says, as we remarked in a note to the first contest, this was McDonnell's favourite defence to the Scotch gambit. Later analysis has shown it to be inferior to the now universally accepted moves of bishop to c5 or knight to f6. Another line of play springing from bishop to b4 check was of frequent occurrence until within a few years, but it is less commendable than either of the moves which we have just mentioned. So McDonnell played queen to f6, and then Bourdonnais played c3. Morphy says, a feasible move at this juncture, although decried by the leading authorities, who agree in recommending castling before advancing the pawn. So Bourdonnais played c3 first, and then McDonnell advanced to d3. Morphy says, McDonnell here selects the best move. It effectually prevents the formation of centre pawns by his adversary, and in a measure retains the action of the white pieces on the queen side. If he captured on c3, then knight captures on c3, bishop to b4, bishop to d2, knight on g to e7, knight to b5, and white's superiority is more marked than in the game as actually played. Again, if bishop to c5 instead, then e5, and then we have a few variations from Morphy here. Black evidently could not have played knight captures the pawn, as white would have won a piece by queen to e2, followed by capturing this pawn. And the key here is that the knight is pinned, and we're going to pick up a major piece. So going back to these variations, queen to g6, and then c captures d4 with a fine game, Morphy says. Had black in this latter variation played instead queen to e7, white would have replied not with capturing the pawn, but with castling and having a very strong attacking game. I think the point here is that you can bring the rook across and have a strong open file up the middle. So, going back to the game as actually played, McDonnell here advances to d3. We have queen captures on d3, d6, castles by white, queen to g6, bishop to f4, bishop to e7, knight on b to d2, and then what was actually played here by McDonnell was h5. But Morphy says, white's pieces are all in the field, while the opponent's forces are comparatively undeveloped. Under these circumstances, it strikes us that black loses time by this premature attempt to form an attack upon the white king's entrenched position. McDonnell's fondness for attack too often betrayed him into those rash onslaughts, which with even players generally recoil against the originator. We should have played knight to h6 and then castled on the next move. However, h5 was played by McDonnell, and then we have rook on f to e1, bishop to h3, knight to h4, and bishop captures the knight on h4. And Morphy says, instead of capturing the knight, queen to g4 would have given rise to some interesting variations. So you might want to figure those out for yourself, because I'm not going to go into them. Morphy didn't. He leaves it to the reader, and I'll give you that chance. So bishop captures on h4 was played. Queen captures on h3. Bishop back to f6. e5 attacking the bishop. The pawn captures on e5 and the bishop captures on e5. And McDonnell immediately captures black with the back with the black bishop, but it's now pinned, so Bourdonnais advances to his pawn to f4. Now we have knight on g to e7, and of course we capture with the pawn. Queen to g4, offering a trade of queens. Bourdonnais accepts, and now McDonnell has this open file, this open h file, which is looking very dangerous. And knight to b3, knight to g6, pushing the pawn to e6, f5. So McDonnell seems to have given Bourdonnais a passed pawn, but we'll see how this plays out. Bourdonnais brings his rook across to d1, knight on c to e5, bishop to d3, rook to h5. It looks like he's going to be castling queenside and doubling up the rooks down the h-file. Bishop back to c2. Oh, and instead of castling queenside, McDonnell has advanced his king to e7, and he'll just bring his rook straight across to h8, I imagine. Knight to d4. King advances some more, and we have rook to f1. Knight to e7. And now, at this point, Bourdonnais plays b4. But Morphy has some comments about this. He says, had it been White's intention to maintain his knight at d4, b4 would have been plausible enough. But as the knight was immediately retreated to e2 and g3, b4 was clearly a loss of time. He should have played knight to e2 at once. So b4 was played, and of course McDonnell doubles up his rooks. We have knight to e2, as Morphy was saying, and of course this pawn is lost, and knight to g3. And at this point we get into some complicated variations that Morphy wanted to let us all know about. So the move that McDonnell actually played was g6, and what Morphy is going to say is that g6 is actually a good move, and with this knight to f3 move, he's going to take us through some variations that explain why g6 was better than this. So pawn captures, and the bishop is taken by McDonnell, and pawn captures, and now we have two blacks on the second rank. And check. So we have two variations that Morphy wants to show us here, and he captures the pawn in this first variation. The knight has to come back, otherwise it's going to be checkmate if this rook comes across. And Morphy says this move is best for McDonnell, back to h6, and check with the rook. It's a very powerful pair of rooks up the center here. and king back to f7. Rook to d7. Attacking, we've got a double attack on the knight here, and the rook comes across, and we have a rook exchange. And now c7 is taken by Bourdonnais. At this point, I believe Morphy has a comment. He says that the result here would seem to prove that black adopted the safest course by playing g6. And he does take us through this other variation where the king moves to the right here, and pawn captures, knight captures. This is a rook sacrifice, but it enables the pawn to get across to the other side, and black's position is not looking too healthy here. He's going to lose this rook or have a promotion, have Bourdonnais promote to a queen. So let's return. And where do we start? So, in conclusion, Morphy says that g6 was the safest course of action for McDonnell here. And so the game proceeds once more. Bishop to b3, king to g5, rook on d to e1, attacking the knight. The knight moves and attacks the rook back. Rook to e3, attacking the knight again, and the knight comes back into f4. Rook to f2, and McDonnell retreats back to h7. Some more rook action down this center pair of files, and knight to h5, and captures, and the king wants to get out of the corner. He goes to f2, and McDonnell wastes no time in pushing the pawn, attacking the rook here, and the rook delivers a check, which is blocked by McDonnell's knight. And Bourdonnais wants to push this pawn. He wants to get the queen, and this pawn, as we mentioned earlier, is still looking very dangerous. And so McDonnell blocks it with the rook, and we have rook to d7, and McDonnell brings back his rook for a triple attack now on this pawn. And Bourdonnais takes the opportunity to capture on c7, and the advanced passed pawn is lost, and we have an exchange of all the rooks on e7. Bourdonnais starts to push his queenside pawns, and king to f5, still pushing the queenside pawns, a5, and McDonnell wants to centralize his king or bring them around these pawns here to help them get across. And we have bishop to d1, attacking one of these doubled pawns. And McDonnell just pushes it, and it's check, and Bourdonnais goes forward with f3. Now in the actual game here, well, let's see what Morphy says McDonnell should have played. McDonnell should have played, according to Morphy, knight to d5, because black might now have won with ease by knight to f5. Suppose knight to f5, then we have these three variations, according to Morphy. We have king to e2, and the knight attacks the bishop, and the bishop has to move aside. Of course, he's forking the bishop and the pawn here. So either he loses the bishop or he loses the pawn. If he loses the pawn, all of these past pawns supporting each other are going to be impossible to stop, and McDonnell is going to win. So let's go back to another one of these variations. If bishop to c2, attacking the knight here, the knight can come down and check, and we have another two variations. Let's choose this one first. The pawns are just going to be too much for the white king to cope with. He can't take the knight now because the pawn will queen, so he has to advance. Again, he can't take the knight because the pawn will advance, so he'll have to capture the pawn, and then he walks straight into this fork, and he's going to lose the bishop. So going back, this other variation the pawn advances, captures, and the other pawn is making its way through. And we're in the same position here where white has to capture the pawn and lose the bishop. And the final variation here is bishop to e2. It's a check on h4 from the knight, and the king can advance to g4, but then he's lost the pawn. And very soon it's going to be game over, because he's going to have to use the bishop to capture the pawn back, and McDonnell is up an entire knight. So if we go back to here, that was what Morphy recommended to play, but McDonnell in the actual game decided to play knight to d5. Labourdonnais replies with bishop to c2, and McDonnell advances the pawns. Labourdonnais pushes the pawns himself, and McDonnell captures the isolated pawn there. Bourdonnais keeps pushing, and it's captures. Morphy says that knight to d5 here is the best move. He says, "The whole of this endgame is remarkable proof of the fact that the very best of players seem at times to be struck with a singular blindness. The simple move of knight to d5 would have evidently at once decided the contest in black's favour." And Morphy doesn't expand on this, but we can just see what might happen. Now there's a passed pawn on this side, and a lot of pawns against this very singular pawn over here. And this is going to be enough to let black win. This is all over basically. What are you going to do? So going back to here, what McDonnell actually played was knight to b5. And the game continued, king to g4, knight to d6, bishop to d3, knight to e4, bishop to e2, king to d5. It looks like he's preparing to go and capture the white pawn. Bishop to f3, pinning the knight. The king comes back, and bishop to e2, king to f6, and according to my engine, this is the point at which McDonnell finally threw away his winning position and achieved a draw once more. He moved to f2, which draws the game, whereas if he'd have gone to c5, according to Stockfish, this is fine. And he carries on with a significant advantage and will, similarly to as the line that we went through before, the weight of the pawns is too much. And eventually black is going to be able to break through, capture the last pawn, and advance everything until black can't cope anymore. But again, McDonnell didn't do this. He threw away the win and went for the draw. So knight to f2, king to h5, the pawn is pushed, bishop captures pawn on b7, king to e7, bishop to c8, king to d6, bishop captures the pawn, king to c6, and it was in this position that presumably they agreed to the draw. So why is it a draw? Well, once the black king has captured the b6 pawn and the white king has captured the f4 pawn, black can put his knight in the corner, protect his remaining pawn, and white can move his bishop to f3 and protect the remaining g2 pawn. And now neither player can make any progress. The white bishop can't attack this pawn on the dark squares, and the knight can't come out of the corner to attack the white pawn. And so there's nothing much to be done. And so that was it. Both players agreed to a draw, the second draw in this match, and they'll have to play another game with labourdonnais as white and McDonnell as black, and to see if they can break this stalemate that they've got going on. So a theme beginning to develop here is McDonnell takes the lead and then throws it away for a draw. We'll see if that continues in the next game. Join me then.